have you seen it blocks it out as well?
Oh, does it?
Yeah, there's 4 little stars.
Bum. Like what? How high up on the swearing thing do you have to go before it blocks it out?
Okay, so let's test. Okay,
Bum.
Shit.
Bollocks.
Yeah, shit gets blocked out.
Bollocks.
Comes up as box. Okay, crap. That works. Okay, so it seems like anything sort of crap or above crap, the crap line.
Okay. All right. There's a crap threshold.
Yeah, the crap threshold. We figured it out.
Okay. Someone probably got paid to do an AI algorithm to determine the crap threshold and come up with a scoring system and everything.
Yeah, we should try. We should actually put some time into this and really, really test it out. Make sure that we
could write an app that says how good is your cursing and probably come up with something with bit of chatbot, bit of AI builder. I'm sure we could live the Power Platform dream with rate your cursing or something and then translate it into different languages. If only we had the time for such imaginative ventures.
Oh, if only. All right. So are we going to officially cut this part of the recording?
We shall see.
We'll see how it goes.
But this time you have questions this time. I've always got questions for you, but you have topics you want to talk about today?
I actually do. And actually it's really topical. But first of all, check this bad boy out. Got it filled in.
Ah, very nice.
I got a COVID bot. Yeah, it's my 5G COVID bot.
By the way, Michelle, who did the logo for us, she wanted to know, there was a few of the tattoos that she saw and she was all fascinated. So I think you've got a fangirl there because I think she's a secret goth. And but anyway, you'll meet her eventually, I'm sure.
Oh man, I'm amped. I actually need to make sure I take notes on this call because this is going to be a real important one.
Okay.
Yeah. So as you know, we've got this event coming up, which is, they called it CDS Saturday, right? Now, which is cool because I think like it's gonna, there's a bunch of different folk all chatting and stuff, and you know there's some Dynamics folk, there's some Power Platform folk, there's some SharePoint folk, there's 1 or 2 Azure folk, but ages ago I registered a session called, and I don't want to give too much away because I know we're going to publish this probably before the event, so I called it CDS versus SharePoint versus SQL. And then after chatting to you and Louise and a couple others, like I'm going to change the whole way the structure of the presentation goes, right? So it's going to be CDS and SharePoint and SQL.
Yep, I think that's smart.
Yeah. So I'm not going to tell them that. I'm going to leave it as that. We're going to talk about it. Then we're going to talk about the great data wars on Twitter. Make it all dramatic. It sounds so cool, and then say, look, you know, after I want to rope you into the conversation to say, you know, after chatting to you, I've gone through an education process which has been really good, and we're going to recommend it to everyone else.
And likewise.
But, yeah, which is awesome, right? So that's exactly why I want to sneak you into the call in the middle, and then sneak Louise into the call at the end, right? To like show that there's no like animosity. We're actually trying to work together to make this awesome. So one of the things that I've found, right, is that there is a Microsoft presentation going around with a bunch of interesting points around the versus category between the 2 sources. I want to show one or 2 of those slides up and say, look, you know, this is the general consensus. Like we'll show that slide with the 4 buckets and the idea is to say, look, what we've figured out over the last 2 months is that actually the slide is irrelevant, and this is why. Because it has to be down to the use case. And actually, at the end of the discussion, dude, it's never going to be just one, right? There's always going to be a hybrid mix, right?
Yep.
And that's what I've discovered over the last few months. Like what I've picked up is that you don't talk about the verses, you talk about the process around, you know, what fits best for that app type or that solution type. Yep. And then as you're going through the use cases, say for an example, you know, you discover that you need a certain set of functionality. It's super fine to build it into lists or SharePoint, like that search functionality you had. But then at a later point, right, if you want to democratize that data into a relational structure with like the auditability and everything, you can do that. The point is that your data storage facilities are always going to be quite dynamic in the sense that you might start somewhere and end somewhere else, or vice versa. So that's the point I want to make in the session, right? And the end goal is to say, we've always said versus, we're scrapping that, and we're talking about it working as a full ecosystem. Yep. So does that make sense? Okay.
That's pretty much the whole premise of why we started talking, right? I was just so over the versus thing. Well, it's just it's simplistic and misleading without intending to be. They're all done well-meaning, but they tend to actually send people down off into the wrong track or following ideologically driven motivations as opposed to evidence-driven. Again, driven by context.
And that's exactly the thing, right? It's the fact that, so I've got this slide. I found this awesome slide. It's got this scale diagram where I'm not going to present it now purely because of the fact that I want to try and save it, but it's got the scale diagram of like personal productivity applications. So you mentioned in your Center of Excellence videos, loads of stuff around this, where you've got this personal productivity solution and then this enterprise grade solution, right? So think about the sliding scale like this. In no world will this cost the same as this. It can't. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you can't say to somebody, you can have the Ferrari for the same amount as you have the VW Beetle. And that's the point, right? So what happens is that we're on a sliding scale from a cost perspective, whether it's build or licensing, on how you license stuff. And actually, that's the premise of the discussion, right? Is that if you have a solution over here using Common Data Service as a backend, it'll work, but you're likely to find that the cost benefit isn't actually there because you're spending so much more on the data structure and you're not getting the value out of it. But here it's totally fine because you've got like loads of complexity and users. Yes. Whereas with SharePoint and lists and even Oakdale to an extent and even SQL, you can probably get away with having that debate. But then when you start moving up the scale, you kind of want to say, well, SharePoint will be good here, but then if you're maximizing the effect, you can probably still use it to an extent over here. But then how much complexity are you willing to bake into the form side, into the flow side? Yeah.
Yeah. So your premise is really good, and I'm so glad you're putting SQL in there, because I actually had a conversation with another person who is absolute gun on SharePoint, like actually one of the best SharePoint people on the planet. Oh, nice. And I was asked, like, why would I even go to like CDS? Why can't I go to SQL? And it wasn't till I started elaborating, well, it's more than just a table. It's the forms, it's the the flows, it's the other stuff and the views. And the fact that, a model-driven app is more of a mashup than it is an actual app. And so once I sort of framed it that way, the penny dropped, and it was like, right, I get it, because the SQL folks, they're a bit like SharePoint looked through a certain lens, but actually the SQL folks look through an even more of a purist lens, where they get the relational thing, no problem, but they don't get the ERP engine kind of aspect of things, and then they look at an entity, look at a SQL table and go, well, why would I do that? And again, so it's that's a really important conversation, because I actually think there's probably more SQL people out there going, well, why would I even think of doing that? I'll just go and throw it in SQL Azure. Once you start to unpack it, then for them, they're looking through quite a narrow lens.
Spot on. And so what I was saying to somebody the other day is that when you look at this like a hybrid approach, right? So when you're looking at actually what's going on now, I might have my personal productivity part of the solution loaded up into lists or SharePoint or whatever, even Oakdale to an extent. Yep. I can deposit data up, right? So it's like a bank account. You can push data up. The minute you take data, that's when you're paying, right? So I can force data up as I need. And that could be into like a CDS or a SQL instance. But I will tell you, with CDS, right, it's highly relational. There's a lot of stuff. I mean, you've learned, right? There's a lot of stuff that happens on under the hood, and that takes a lot of space. So when you have a highly relational data structure, when you're looking at flat data, like the lowest level of an account or something where you have transactions, CDS will be able to store it, but then you're going to be paying money, right? Yep. Because every one of those lowest level of the transactions has to have an owner, right? Which is then associated to a team or a user or the organization. There's security associated to it. There's all those layers, right? And because you've got all those layers, you're maximizing API calls and maximizing space. So what do? You route it into SQL or Azure Data Lake. And then you reference it through things like virtual entities where you're not having to load the CDS with all that sort of flat data. And that's why I say the mashup is, you're spot on, like this consolidation of information. And then your model-driven app shows you relational pieces. Your canvas can show like your point and shoot part of the application, or even a little bit more complex than that. Like you can break it down into a couple of things that will then be part of the wider process. And then your SQL and Azure Data Lake are your like mass storage facilities.
Well, I mean, I'm living the dream basically. You know, there's a project I've been working on. We briefly talked about it last time, and since that was the turbine one, you know, the one with the kind of facilities management type scenario, which was a model-driven app, I have embedded Canvas apps in that solution, both within the forms as well as just within the sitemap. As I eagerly await the new feature for Pages to drop. And there's some really nice things about responsive stuff coming in Canvas apps very soon. So again, it's that both and now, where it made this particular use case was highly relational. It just made no sense to do it in SharePoint for scale and just degree of the relationships involved. But at the same time, there were aspects of that functionality that if I didn't embed a Canvas app, I would have had to write a whole lot of web components or PCF components and stuff. And so it just, again, that's almost transcend, or it sort of violates the low code sort of little bar that I've got. But I go, no, if I can put this in a Canvas and I take advantage of the connectors and the DLP and all that sort of stuff, still talking to the same data. And anyway, it worked tremendously well. So this was in relation to what this was, it was actually calculating effective life of a part, you know, as you take things in and out and the manufacturer specs and you put it in, and you know, it's a simulation. What if I put it here for this long, and how long would it, you know? And so it was spitting out an answer, and that's the sort of thing that Canvas apps kick ass at. To bake that into a model form would have been quite a lot of custom work and a whole bunch of JavaScript, which was unnecessary. So no, I've got a good sense now of the convergence of the user interfaces, right? 2 years ago, you know, the big plan was announced. I remember Charles Samana saying this was the intent, and I thought, great idea, but I can't see how it would work. Now I can.
Yeah, because you see it snapping those little bricks together, right?
Yeah, and so too at the data layer, you see, because it does facilitate. You're dead right. You know, the audit app that we started this series with, you could pretty much take anything that's older than a month out of that app and then push it up into CDS or a data lake, and SharePoint then remains perfectly adequate for what it's doing. You know, good for media, good for that rich, quick capture, and without any worry to have to, you know, sort of refactor it to talk to another data source.
And that's exactly, that's why I think it has to be a mashup. And more and more that I see, you know, ever since I've taken on the perspective of use case, rather than like, oh, it's always going to be just CDS, it started to open up a lot of other doors. I mean, I was talking to a partner recently, and this was to their SharePoint team. And, you know, I mentioned you, and I remember when I spoke to you last time, I'm like, wait, why am I like reading a message from you and I can hear your voice? It was your COE videos. But yeah, it was awesome because they, you know, when I came at it from that approach, it was kind of like the and rather than the versus. Yep. And it's a huge mashup. And the thing that I love about Canvas apps embedded in model, actually on that note, is the fact that a lot of people think that you have to integrate data. So everyone's like, let's move data into places. And I'm like, wait. The first rule of integration is don't integrate. So you can either have a model app, okay, and then integrate to another data structure or data storage facility and move data between the two, knocking out your API calls, creating, you know, potential complexity, or just embed a Canvas app in the model app and talk directly to the data structure.
Yep.
That's way easier. Same with Power BI. And that's the thing, like you have these UI data integrations. So functional integrations are becoming far more relevant than actual technical data integrations at the moment.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite things right now. And like the embedded Canvas app, also because you've got UI freedom, you've got the ability to kind of design whatever you want. The question that I keep on getting asked is, when would I use an embedded Canvas app and when would I use a Power Apps control or a Power Apps component framework control?
That's actually, well, my answer to that's an interesting one, but my answer is probably my default position, and this is only because I don't think there's been enough, I don't think we could have enough use cases to say, here is the established best practice and here's when to use this versus the other. So therefore, I would start out with a Canvas app. It's your way to prototype, you know, because you can, you know, that's the thing. The nice thing about a Canvas app is you can rapidly prototype it, you can embed it in there. And if you hit a point where you go, okay, this is not going to work, I need to go a PCF, then you can sort of transition to that one. We're building a PCF right now. I can't talk about what it's there for, but we've had that scenario where we had a particular need for a PCF to do a particular piece of functionality. Just because the Canvas app gallery kind of construct, and the UI couldn't quite give us what we needed as efficiently as we wanted. So in that case, we were there. But to those people that haven't done much Canvas app work, and you're pondering this, I would say you have a good crack at Canvas apps, because A, you'll find out a whole bunch of stuff and realize it can go pretty damn far. B, that's a skill set that you can apply to many other prototyping innovation scenarios. And I suspect that the PCF thing it's the future of how you would do web components. Like that's how it's going to be, because it fits in both. And so it is definitely a part of it, but it's a bit like, maybe I'll equate it to this. In a Canvas app, you've got 350 connectors, and then you can go make custom connectors. Yeah. And you wouldn't go and make a custom connector unless you had a specific need and one of the existing connectors won't do it for you. You'd always try with the existing connector, and unless you had a security policy thing or a data governance thing that prevented you from doing it, okay, fine, go custom. I think that same principle kind of applies with the Canvas versus PCF. I'd always have a crack at doing it in Canvas first. And again, don't forget that Canvas is probably a better mobile experience for things like integration with the device and capturing telemetry data to do with location and things like that. So there's just more fringe benefits in developing the skills on the Canvas app side so that you're informed to decide when it's a PCF thing, Yeah,
I agree. That's my approach as well, because I can't code, right? Well, let's put it this way. I probably could, but I just haven't done it in a very long time.
Yeah,
so
you and me both.
Yeah, I don't know. It just didn't seem like the right plan, and then it felt like an overkill from a time perspective. I mean, I could whack something up in a Canvas app in a couple of hours that worked super well and looked awesome, or I spent all this time Googling code samples. And if I was Ivan Fitzko, so he's a machine at writing PCFs, he can smack one up in 15 minutes, but the guys knows the formulas backwards.
Yep.
Whereas I haven't even had the time to learn that. So for him, it's probably the other way around. But
yeah, and I also know, for example, like just on a practical sense, as right now, and I'm not speaking from inside Microsoft that has preview stuff. My business partner is just like the guy you were talking about, where he does PCF and he's a JavaScript React guy. And he was telling me the PCF stuff right now is still a little bit rough around the edges in terms of customization of the property panel. Like you can only have an advanced property, those sort of things. So there's elements there to be aware of. But certainly, I think that PCF pushes you out of the low code paradigm, and you're into JavaScript paradigm. You're into Node, VS Code, that whole regime. And so if you have if the use case and your skills in the organization justify that, go for it. But I'd lean to pushing as far as you can get out of the Canvas and model world first.
I agree. I totally agree. I think that's probably what I would do as well. Okay, I've got a couple of random things I want to ask you, if that's cool. It's totally down to this is information I've been fed. I've done a little bit of research, but I guess it would be good if you could help me out here with this. Just to help frame a discussion, right? And this will frame our infiltration into the CDS crowd on that Saturday. Right, so it's kind of cheeky, right? So I've got these slides, and I ran this past a good friend of mine who's part of the SharePoint team at a very large GSI. So she's badass, and she knows you as well. She knows of you. I told her I was talking to you, and she's like, "Oh my gosh, Paul!" So basically, from a SharePoint / so forget Oakdale, forget SQL, right? Because at the moment the light, and forget lists, because the lists thing I think is, so again, we're going to touch on that later if that's cool. So like, if I take a look at SharePoint and CDS, that's where the arguments effectively started. There's been a set of some information that's been shared that I'm like quite interested in getting your opinion on. So maybe it's a good time. Do you think I should share the deck? Actually, I'm gonna. Right, and then we can maybe live note it or something, because I'm interested to see.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm interested to see what your perspective is here, man. And I'll just assume that because I'm not a SharePoint nerd, like I don't understand.
Yep, sure.
Stuff. So some of it when it gets brought up, some highlighted areas that I was slightly concerned about.
Yep. Okay.
Because I wasn't sure, right? So basically, the breakdown is there's a comparison. Now it's not a brutal comparison. It's actually quite an interesting one but there's a comparison between what's happening in SharePoint and what's happening in CDS. So these slides, I purposely presented to my friend, and I said, look, I want to tell you like where I think I'm not super happy with what's being said, and it's only because I don't know, right? So they've broken it down into collaboration. So it's collaboration, volume, data model, business rules and validations, data ingestion and migration.
Okay.
Permissions and governance, and then summary. Like, so I didn't even know, because when I looked at this, the first thing I thought was, okay, are those, number one, the right things to be looking at? Because I don't necessarily know if they are. And number two, is this even a comparable thing? Is this like an apples and apples comparison, or is this something that you actually can't compare because it's like it's totally different from what the use case potentially would stipulate? So yeah, you get where my thinking is. Like, is this something you can compare?
Let's have a look through some of them. Let's just work through some and let's answer it by just sort of throwing rocks at it a little bit or shaking it around.
Perfect.
So this is all about, now they've said use case, SharePoint collaboration, CDS relational records. It's not so much a use case, but anyway, fair enough. I get what they're trying to do there. So great for collaborative productivity scenarios where content is expected to be widely shared and edited by multiple parties. I think what they're basically just suggesting there is, it's not uncommon to have SharePoint sites, or since SharePoint's powered your intranet, certainly, content to a wide variety of users. That's fair in the sense that SharePoint has good integration with Active Directory, right? So certainly there's less work to do insofar as being able to go, here's a site, anyone in this group can access it with this permission level in SharePoint. So that's probably the widely shared piece. That's one angle to it. And the other one is the B2B scenario. SharePoint can be shared externally if you so have set that policy up. Your Active Directory folks have decided that's something worth doing. So that widely shared then extends to extranet scenarios where, I guess in the Power Platform, if you want to do that, you've got to use portals. Portals is another thing. So the models, whereas SharePoint is everything, it's your model-driven app equivalent and it's your portal equivalent, and it probably doesn't do either of those two as effectively as the fit-for-purpose tools, but obviously it's the one tool, right? So it can get you quite far. So share within a large.
Looking for,
So look, I read that, I go, I get, if my interpretation of what they're talking about is correct, then that's okay. I think that the shared within a large team, I think, relates to the fact that SharePoint has a history of being intranet type scenarios with departmental sites, and some of those departments can be really big, and it handles AD groups. So therefore, feed it a group, and it'll happily say, "Yep, you're in, not a problem." So when you get down to the granular level, I think SharePoint starts to get less powerful.
And I think my biggest worry was. When you're looking at the primary use cases, well, like you said, it's not a use case, it's technical.
It's an orientation of an app, I suppose. It's like a category of use case, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is.
But collaboration versus relational records on that same, it's a bit like saying comparing a motorbike to, an air conditioner in a way.
So that was exactly my worry, man. It's like I wasn't convinced that comparing that to that was at all. I mean, if you're going to say use cases collaboration, you want to compare SharePoint collaboration with CDS collaboration.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I actually think you've got it. If you were to if you were going to break this slide apart, you split it into two and you make collaboration and relational records. But I assume relational records will pop up later in data model. I actually think it's the relational records term is probably the one that's the more problematic one, because it's really that it's how do you encapsulate a model driven set of use cases, what do you call them, back of house, kind of
mid-office type stuff.
Yeah, that's what I would put there. Something like that would make more sense.
So I'm thinking about breaking it down into, so you say mid-office, front office, frontline worker, something like that, and then maybe look at it from that perspective.
I think so. I think it's one lens. Like you'll never get a perfect classification, right? Because there are absolutely frontline worker scenarios in the model and dynamics world, right? But it's fair to say that a Canvas app is very much oriented towards that frontline, specific use case, specific persona-driven solution.
I agree with you. So that's where I was going with this, because I always feel, I mean, that's the thing, we have to be able to compare apples with apples, not bikes with air cons.
Yeah.
So I think if I were to look at this from say frontline, okay, so if we kind of backtrack and we say we're going to look at this from a frontline worker perspective, without even thinking about the data structure, we know first and foremost that Canvas Apps is always going to win that fight.
Oh, yeah.
It's without a shadow of a doubt. I mean, even when you look at what's available in the CDS mobile experience, if you've got the fat finger technician that's got to fly a drone and inspect a turbine, they are never going to be able to capture that level of data directly with their tiny weeny little. So yeah, right. I think that's it. I think where the mixture of them comes in really beautifully is front office, where you've got this sort of process-driven user experience, and then your Canvas app adding in those like real nuggets of truth. And then the mid-office, I actually think probably also is a mixture. I've seen mid-office applications working pretty well just within model, and that's fine because it's process-driven. It's like, do this next. But if you look at the experience that a Canvas app gives you, that embedded app actually changes the whole way you interact with the system. So I would say frontline workers always Canvas. Very few times it's going to be CDS, and I think maybe that would be like in the event of a highly process-driven mobile experience that required and then front office and mid office is going to be a mixture of the two. Yeah. Cool. Okay.
Yeah, so it's a little, because like even in the conversation, you know, we're drifting to Canvas, and Canvas is agnostic towards CDS or SharePoint, right? So we've sort of talked about the use case, the front office use case. But again, that front office use case, front office SharePoint, front office CDS, really at that point, the driver for whether you would go one versus the other is probably the broader process in which that front office app is a part of. Because in my audit example, what's great about that one is that makes perfect sense to go into SharePoint, because there's not, even if there is some elaborate process around it, there's not a business process flow that you need to track a guy out in the field capturing an audit on something. You know, it's just done. It goes in, it gets reported on in Power BI. Whereas if you were doing some other sort of, you know, quite a regulatory process-driven thing that has really strict audit capabilities, that's where you do your bit in the front, and then someone basically, you know, a process owner has to then track and see that and make sure everything's being managed appropriately. So, you know, something with a really complex approval, you know, sub-process that does some more work, and, you know, then track the continuous improvement and, you know, all of that. That absolutely then starts to, you go, that's a CDS scenario. You know, you've just got a lot of different stuff here.
The way I frame it to people is with this scenario is actually, I don't know how it works in Oz, but in the UK we've got a thing called antisocial behaviour.
Yep.
ASB is effectively like in housing associations. If you live in a neighborhood or something, and then you've got a bunch of kids that are like trashing cars and, you know, spray painting stuff. What will happen is that people will report an ASBO, okay? Yeah. And an antisocial behavior case, I mean, dude, it goes really, some of the stuff gets really brutal. Hey, they log stuff like domestic abuse and things, which is really hardcore. So my theory, if I'm looking at that data, right, I know that data is going to then be made relevant in a court of law at some point.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Because in my mind, like, business process flow is all over that.
Yeah, and that's it, man. And, you know, they have to be able to print out updates to those records. You have to have a full audit history of what's gone on, even to the point of read sometimes. They have to know every single person that touched that record. They have to know who interacted when. So remember the Teams discussion we were talking about around how people... So it gets brutal, man, and that type of data. So I said to somebody, I've said to people, are you comfortable about putting that type of data in Excel, and do you feel like that data can be trusted in the courts of law? No. Okay. So then, do you feel that data could be trusted in a SharePoint list or a set of lists? And the answer was no. Sorry.
I think the set of lists is probably the key part to that conversation, I reckon, because For the CDS people listening, SharePoint has built-in version history. It'll give you a history of every change made to something, and you can go to a list item, you can click version history, and there it is. Isn't particularly easy to get to from a reporting point of view, so it's more kind of, going to an individual record and say, show me what's happened there. So I think that, if you had a scenario where you had a single list or a couple of lists, you're writing some data to it, and you've turned on version history, and who knows, maybe you are even writing that to a separate list. It's kind of quite a common scenario as well, right? I'm kind of okay with that. It just comes back to a list like that probably has got some security stuff on it at data level, so that limits your scalability with SharePoint. But B, if it's part of that broader process and you've got a whole lot of other entities and tables that rely on that data and leverage that data, I start to get a bit uncomfortable in the SharePoint scenario there.
So that's cool.
But look, I've got another use case where we've got 15 different SharePoint lists putting things together, but the use case is actually constructing a document, and only 12 of them are created a year. And basically, so we're not talking high volume, and each person goes in and records all their little bit with Canvas apps, and person clicks the big fat button, and it constructs the document for them for that particular site. So again, maybe call that it's compliance driven, but you see, maybe it's a matter of scale. In that one, there's not a big elaborate process. They don't have to track it, or the volume of data we're talking about, you can have a Power BI porting straight to SharePoint for something like that, and you can see what's going on. But so I think that it's funny. It's a real tacit thing, isn't it? You give me some use cases and I go, yeah, I'd totally do that in CDS world, and then other use cases I'm like, but even now sometimes it's hard for me to pick out the individual criteria that I'm using. It's almost like post hoc. I can tell you the criteria I use, but it seems to be an instinctive thing at the start. But now let's have a look at this second point just real quick. So data was reported the point side.
This is the point of contention, my friend.
Okay, let's have a look.
Where I was like, so my friend was around. She was like, okay, these were the two focus areas, right? So I really want to show you the slide. I'm just trying my level best not to, but just think of that scale diagram, right?
Yep.
I'll send the slide to you privately, by the way. But it was so I said to her, look, CDS will work at any layer of the organization. It doesn't matter, and I'm pretty sure SharePoint lists probably could, but where is the line? Like, where in your organization and other organizations, where do you feel that like this is where you should be implementing things? And actually, without me prompting at all, this is what she mentioned, which is actually fine because it aligned with my thinking originally. But I wanted to run it by you because I know you've implemented pretty awesome applications that store data in lists, but at more than 100 users.
Yeah. For me, it's not so much like that. That's a rule of thumb. For me, the rule of thumb is more data volume and data complexity. So like, for example, that order app scenario, I don't have a problem with lots and lots of users doing that and have, 1 million plus records in the list, to be honest with you, because you're accumulating data. We're not like slicing and dicing and doing all sorts of analysis across sectional. So in a data accumulation scenario, I'm kind of okay with it going higher. And of course, if the volume of transactions is not that high, then hell, you can have 1,000 users for all I care. But if you're hitting it hard and you're hitting it consistently, then there is absolute limits. Because, for example, and I have to qualify this too, you've got to design your SharePoint list a little bit carefully with a bit of forethought if you're going to do things at scale. Better than it used to be. But, for example, if you were to, if you put this is a classic, this actually bit me a while ago. You have 4,999 items in a SharePoint list. And you go, something, I'm going to change the permission model of this list. I'm going to break the inheritance from the site in which it is. And I'm going to add a new group that can access this list and write to it, but they can't write to anywhere else in the site. Okay. So that's fine for the, from 0 to 4,999, that's fine. The minute you hit 5,000, it goes, yeah, I'm not going to do that. And the reason is, a transaction like that is a table lock in SQL level.
Is it?
So yeah, because of the way that now I could be out of date in but this is how it traditionally was. The whole 5,000 limit was to do with just sort of table locking, certain operations. You got to lock the table, because if I recall, and I'm super vague on this now, but back when I had SharePoint on-prem and you could look at SQL at the schema, there was just a big fat table called lists, if I recall. So everything was kind of in there. So that's where a lot of that came from. It's driven by SharePoint comes from a predefined schema that helps SharePoint, and you're building on top of it, right? Whereas CDS is a bit more, you make an entity, it is a table, So for me, the 100 users, it's a useful rule of thumb, but I actually think there's kind of a formula of number of users, number of transactions, and volume of data you're writing. And the big one for me is if you
the write is cool. That's the thing that I'm actually, so the writing and putting it is fine. It's what you're doing with it, taking it out. And I feel like the taking it out, it's exactly the same as, shoving, because you've got the delegation on the Canvas app, right? If you're shoving X amount of records into a list, you only got that 2,000 limit, right?
Yep.
So you have to apply loads of filters, which is cool. But I think you've actually hit the nail on the head with this, Paul. Putting data in is cool. You can have millions of records. It's what you do with those records that really matters.
I think, look, my background in this is in the SharePoint on-prem days. I wrote a whole bunch of blog posts on, SharePoint kind of disk IO performance management and various other things. And I went really low level with that stuff. And I sort of came to realize it's very similar when you're planning infrastructure. The workload, the pattern of the workload is much bigger, sort of discussion. Actually, I used a metaphor back then. I'm going back years, but anyway, let me try this. You go to the shops. You know how you got the express lane? Where you do 12 items or less. Now that's like, think of that as a queue. Now, so long as people turn up with their 12 items in a basket, that queue has a lot higher throughput, right? And it's fast. And then the other lanes in your supermarket tend to have the more bigger room, because you can unload your whole trolley on the thing and, it gets processed. So that one has a higher volume it can handle, right? But the throughput's, well, actually, you could argue the throughput's actually comparable, because, like if you put someone with a huge trolley load into the 12 items lane, right, you're going to clog up that whole lane and make everything terrible. So exactly. that 12 items lane is actually optimized for small payloads, right?
Yeah,
high volume, small payloads. And so that was, the reason where that all came from was, of course, in SharePoint, right? If you're writing SharePoint list, small payload, but SharePoint deals with binary files. You upload a crap load of files into SharePoint. That's a very different IO kind of pattern in terms of what happens. So even planning disk configuration, all of that sort of stuff was very much driven by quite a few different factors. And that's why I think that's one dimension, but I reckon that's a useful lead indicator. That's an okay proxy, but it makes assumptions on certain usage patterns. So
that's perfect.
But personal, team, and org. That was again for scope of data access, was it? I'm making
that assumption. Yeah, it was to do with this point. That's why I was like, for me that was like my rule of thumb right now, because I had nothing else to benchmark.
And I'd probably challenge the second point a little bit, but I have to be really precise with the basis of my assumption. SharePoint has for decades powered intranets for large organizations with, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of users. You set up a server. So, it's got distributed caching, and it's got some serious capability for serving up that kind of data. Yeah. So it comes back to, if you're serving up SharePoint data and the use case is it's mainly about consuming, because think of an intranet, it's 99.9% read. So to that extent, SharePoint can scale quite far, and it's been proven to do that work. But obviously, if that's, if 100,000 people were writing to it, that's a whole different story. I think so. That's that one again. I think both of those statements have got unarticulated assumptions around usage patterns that I think need to be made more clear.
So what we need to do is we need to define, I don't think we can define it actually, but we probably need to put some benchmarks in and say, well, look, this is fine. Like, we can make these assumptions, but it's going to be around usage patterns. What defines a usage pattern? And that's going to be, if you have 1 million records in a SharePoint list and you've got 100,000 people reading off that list, you're going to get hammered. It's that simple, right? But if you've got 1 million records in that list, you've got 100,000 people putting data in there, you can put data in as full as long as you want, but you're not doing anything with it. You're just storing, right? And that's the part that I'm trying to figure out. And I think you probably hit the nail on the head for me, is that with CDS, the data is not about just storage. It's about how you consume it. And that highly relational structure is like when you open up a record and you've got multiple subgrids talking to other parts of the other entities and things, and like being able to do many to many and all that type of stuff. Like for me, that's got to be, because it's highly, man, there's so much activity that goes on in that database.
Yeah, I think SharePoint people need to go to App in a Day and build a model-driven app, because there are superficial similarities in SharePoint. The fact that SharePoint has a web part, and I can drop a web part on a page, and I can link that web part into a list, and I can configure a view on that list, and that view is what you see in the web part. So I can create pseudo model-driven mashups in SharePoint. However, it's just so simple compared to what you can do in a fit-for-purpose, model-driven designed system. And I think that the SharePoint folks do need to actually go and build some entities, build some forms, build some views, definitely build some business process flows, do some of the roll-ups and calculations, pull them together into a model-driven app, and just think about it with that web part paradigm in mind. That's the best way to kind of, it's the logical starting point to understand it. But yeah, I think
that makes sense to me.
Yeah, I'm actually just looking at the third point, and I think the third point's a good one. Now this, and I'm just wondering why you highlighted semi-structured, not highly relational, because this is, we're sort of drifting into the model-driven relational aspect. So what was the aspect to that you were querying?
So I think the concept of semi-structured data means something different to everyone, right? So if you talk about semi-structured data to a CDS person, it's code, right? It's JavaScript and plugins, and they get drops and
that's totally different.
And then I know what they're talking about here, right? So I know semi-structured data it's kind of like, it's not quite relational, right? So you're using elements of that data for, metadata could be considered semi-structured in my brain, or a list of things without a relation to another list, or basic relations to another list. So in my brain, I read it like that, and then I thought, okay, that's really smart. So unstructured and semi-structured, super good in SharePoint. Dude, can I tell you, between us when listening on this call, I would never turn the Common Data Service into a document repository, okay? Yeah. In fact, and I think I've said this to you before, like my goal, if I see the CDS being used as a document storage tool, and like people, bastardizing it to do metadata tags and everything using a custom entity on a document, you're asking for trouble. You can store stuff in blob, but it's just meant for very singular type things, so single serving images. Whereas SharePoint, you've got huge amounts of functionality, and you mentioned the search functionality as well, which doesn't exist in CDS for this type of forced unstructured and semi-structured.
Yeah. So well, look, SharePoint has a super rich API for document stuff, and and there's actually a whole bunch of document management specific things that you would have to re-implement if you're going into CDS. So CDS really is limited to, I've attached this document to a record in an entity, but if you go beyond that, that just doesn't kind of make sense to me, because that SharePoint's bread and butter, and it's actually pretty damn good at that. And then plus, don't forget, you've got OneDrive Sync, right? There's your offline story taken care of. You've got some of the records management stuff, like information policy management policies, lifecycle expiry, document sets. Like there's a whole bunch of document centric things. We don't have to go into them now, but. So no, I'd agree with you on that. So that's why I read that semi-structured in my mind, because coming from an Office SharePoint, is basically data that's structured into columns reasonably well, but not relational in the way a SQL or a CDS person would think about it. And look, the closest thing SharePoint has to relational is you can define a column in a list, and it's called a lookup column, and you can point it to a different list. And the one thing it actually has referential integrity. There is a little tick box that says,
I've seen that with the parent-child stuff. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
It's got that. And the other thing that's useful is you can pick the fields that you want to bring back into the parent entity, like the child.
I really like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and by the way, that comes up in Canvas apps. They're available in the gallery. So if you actually do that and then hit it via link it to an edit form or a gallery or probably a data field. I never use those data tables, but you will see those ones. But that's about as the closest you get. However, I had a bias against using that, but that was only because patching relational stuff in SharePoint for a while used to really suck because you had to use the OData. You had to basically stick JSON into your patch to get it right. And then, about a year ago, Chax and his team basically made that go away, and I was super happy. And a lot of people don't realize, by the way, I see a lot of code in Canvas apps where people have Googled how to patch like SharePoint choice columns and they're totally doing it the hard way. It's actually supremely easy these days. So, but that's still, even though, so I point that out, but that's a far cry from the sort of relational structures that you get in CDS. And my one little gripe though is the day that CDS can do more than one relation level down, with the dot notation, all my Christmases come at once, because that truly will sell the value to people who run apps.
When you can do more than one hop on a relational entity, I'll literally fly to Oz and I'll smash beers with you.
Yeah, hell yeah, because like that bites me to this day, because it's fine in a model-driven app. It's not so crash hot in a Canvas app when you then start to have to, because actually my recent one was I unfortunately had a many-to-many relationship, and then the field in the child table, I had another relationship to the users table, like a people style record. And I had to get the first name out of the person, but I had to go back to the parent, the top level one, and do a filter on that to determine it. And of course I couldn't because of that damn hidden in between entity. And so you helped me out yesterday with, you were like, that was one of those scenarios where you go, no, just go and do your own mapping entity for that one. So thank you for that. But you can imagine how much nicer it would have been if I could just, that second gallery, which its items property is set to, parent.child, and then I just go child.user.fullname. That's what I want to do.
And even if, who cares if it's a string that long, like a set of relational commands that long, we'll get it. But check, this is what I was referring to. Check it out on this diagram. So there we go.
Oh, I've seen this. Yeah, let's have a good look at this. I've seen it, but I've never had a real, cast my critical Office bias eye over it to see how much it's. Let's have a look.
Actually, in my opinion, dude, I still think that this is kind of here.
Yeah. I actually, totally. Because no, you know what it is? I'll tell you what it is. Basically, that's the ability to export to a data lake natively, but that's as long as it's Azure. So that's okay. That's kind of fair that it's there. It's like it's built in. Webhooks is an interesting one because SharePoint can do that.
Yeah, I've never actually explored this. Honestly, these two, I've never actually explored. I mean, I've never had the reason to. Yep. Obviously, it's always down to the use case, and I've just never had to. This is the one that actually interested me, the storage layer, because a lot of people make the assumption that CDS is just like a pretty layer on top of a SQL database, and it's not, because it actually pushes data into these various structures, depending on what the data you're saving. And this is the more Azure version of it, right?
I think that's actually an overlooked point, and that's something that the SQL folks need to also appreciate too, because you're exactly right. They're like, why would I use entities and do this? And it wasn't until kind of I explained the point earlier on the other things you get in terms of forms, views, but I also made the point exactly that you're making of the fact that it's actually a layer across multiple different storage infrastructure that gives you the best of all of those worlds.
That's it. And I think what the thing is, I think they're just going to add more and more. And my thoughts are, so this probably isn't, so this is a Chris thought, not a Microsoft thought, right? I think that as new storage facilities get generated, because there's always new great stuff coming out, right? And there's loads of innovation. As new storage facilities get built in, I'm assuming that they can just snap stuff in here, like little bricks, right?
Yeah.
So say for an example, I don't think this will ever happen, but SQL becomes not the choice relationship data structure you might put in something else there, or you might want to use Cosmos, or I don't know, whatever. I just think that they've done this to make sure that they can do that in the back end without breaking anything for us as like mid or APAS users, application platform users.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think that's exactly right. And certainly, for example, I already know for a fact that blob storage sits there because no blob data is actually in the underlying SQL table. That's all managed by CDS view, which is terrific. SQL folks have to roll their own solution for that. So I'm looking at things like the stuff that I suppose, I mean, at the end of the day, this is telling you what's in the box. So I'm looking at jobs, business rules, some of that stuff. And I think, like SQL people would cast their eye over this and go, well, we've got that, we've got that, we've got that. So I got to keep reminding myself, this is just purely telling you what's in the box for Common Data Service. And I think that, there's, the other thing they're missing here, data flows. Data flows is huge. That should be an integration.
I was going to say, that layer should be here. Well, that should be this layer. I've been tempted to just put it in there.
No, you totally should. Hey, and there's also, what's the other one that's there? There's another technology. I see it in the Power Platform Admin Center. It's related to the Dynamics workload. When you go to Power Platform Admin, there's like an integration piece there.
The integrator tool.
Yeah, the one that it feels like you're about to go into data flows, but you realize no, it's specifically for the Dynamics workloads.
It is, it's how do I explain this? So it's the CDS integrator functionality. It exists sort of there, and you can connect up to most data sources. I've used it a couple of times, but to be quite honest, man, most people that I talk to are using stuff like Data Factory or Logic Apps. Yeah, it's all right.
Virtual entities should be going in integration too, I reckon. I think that's actually, I've never used them, but SharePoint used to have something called BCS, Business Connectivity Services, which was the same thing. It was a virtual SharePoint list. So it's the same intent, but I think it could be done, and it has, virtual entities have very similar limitations, as you can imagine, given that they're external. I think that's missing out of the integration piece. I think virtual entities is actually something that's really quite interesting.
I like them. I've had the use case. So one of the use cases I had many moons ago at a big train company was that they had a lot of sort of systems outside of there. It was a dynamic system, but actually looking back on it, you could probably have gotten away with doing it in just Power Platform. They had a lot of external stuff that they needed to expose directly against what they called a passenger record. And that would be perfect. Absolutely perfect, because you can have it look and feel the exact same way. I would have used that with Canvas app, actually, one of those two, now that if I had the opportunity to build that now.
That's where things get interesting, virtual entities surfaced in a Canvas app via gallery, that's kind of what was 10, 20, 15 years ago, SharePoint came out with BCS and everyone just lost their minds because you had a SharePoint list that was connected to a live data source and I could make views and there was a web part and I could do that mashup kind of thing. And it seems very quaint now when you look at what, of course, but still that's actually, that idea has been around for quite a while. And I think it's probably one of those hidden gems that's probably overlooked or not a lot of people aren't aware of. Probably doesn't help that it's not exposed via the modern user interface yet. You've got to go back into the classic way.
And there's more of that. I've just looked. I've got to jump on a meeting in 5 minutes, man.
No worries.
I think that's the point that actually I think is really important here, is that some of the stuff inside CDS, if you don't know where to go, you will never find it. And some of it's like not Bingable or Googleable or whatever search engines are favorites this week. But the virtual entities is one of them. There's a few others, but
I would actually say that I would add to that I actually always Google Dynamics CRM now if I want to actually find stuff, because of the fact that it's not been enough with the name change. But the other point I would make, and this happened to me today actually, I had to make a app principal based user in CDS, and I had to go back to the old way. And the person that was sitting there with me had never seen this stuff before, and of course he didn't have the context of the Dynamics CRM roots that a lot of CDS you can't escape. So of course none of it made sense. And so it's definitely I wouldn't say intimidating, but a lot of it is counterintuitive, because if you haven't come from that world, half of the navigation is not really relevant to, pure play CDS kind of person. And so the more as they get things into that unified interface, the sooner the better, because the minute I have to go out the back there, usually I kind of tend to scare people, because they're like, what the hell is this? Is this Dynamics? What were they having?
I call it taking the seat covers off. So it's like, honestly, I just genuinely don't. I'm not a huge fan of the way it looks. But you know what? Like, there are moving stuff. They've deprecated, or let's put it this way, turned off a lot of things. But I think in the next few years or next few months, you're going to see a lot more moving. And also, I reckon that the more we can start like talking to people about how and why these things work together, the better it's going to be. The better it's going to be from a Power Platform perspective. But yeah, you're right, man. I think legacy dynamics. Okay, I'm going to tell you something. Ryan Cunningham and I got into a licensing call that Louise Free set up, and it was a really good one. But one of the chaps in the chat kept on saying to me, "This is Dynamics," and I'm like, "No. This is not Dynamics, this is Power Platform. Dynamics customer engagement cannot exist without the Power Platform. It's not the other way around." Right? Unfortunately, some of the branding still says Dynamics.
Yes.
And I get the perception of that. I totally do. I get that, sometimes there's a stigma about a product, and, the great data wars says that Dynamics versus SharePoint, but it's not like that anymore. This is a consolidation of data structures. We need to learn to work together. So people have got to get Dynamics out of their head and start getting CDS, Microsoft lists, all that type of stuff instead.
Totally.
Oh man, I get excited about this stuff.
That's probably you have a meeting. That's a good note. This is like the quickest, most disciplined conversation we've had ever. So
weird, man. No. It's only because I just got back from the dentist, so I'm like, gotta get shit done.
I see. Well, we're very well behaved. So, good talking. There's definitely more topics to continue with, as I've been, going further on my various adventures as well. So, hopefully, chat soon. Squeeze a spot in your busy calendar for me.
Honestly, I really appreciate all that info you're giving me. I've got notes. You're probably going to hear me whacking away on my keyboard, but I think what I'm going to do is I'm probably just going to stick some stuff together. I might fire it over to you just for a checkbox, if you're willing. And I just want to make sure the right message gets across at the end of the day to the right people.
Just remember that, we're all wrong. It's just by degrees of how wrong. So I'm sure plenty of people will disagree with what I've told you.
So I have this saying, I'm always in shit. It's just the depth that varies. My friend, thanks a lot. Hey, I appreciate the time.
All right. See you, mate.
Chat later, dude.
Bye.
Ciao.